Hello again, everyone. I hope you are all well today. Once again, it's Casey Pax here to talk to you about artists throughout art history and the art that makes up our country. But before I start, I always like to begin with an acknowledgement about where we all are right now, and kind of what is happening around us. So this is a time of a lot of change and adjustment and change. And it can be really hard to deal with all that uncertainty or maybe all the emotions that you're feeling, and you might not find there's an outlet for them, or maybe you don't know exactly how to express them. So these feelings of uncertainty, anxiety, restlessness, maybe anger and rage, maybe hope and joy, but they're all might be mixed up inside of us. And that can lead to us finding it's hard to find structure in our days, or maybe a way to let it out. And that's when I think the arts can really step in. We can turn to artwork as an outlet for our emotions and creativity as an outlet. So if you're an artist in the way of a painter, or you like to draw or make sculpture, to use that time to do that, or maybe you're a cook and a gardener, and you can use the creativity to maybe get out those emotions you're feeling, or allow yourself space to maybe shut off those emotions in your mind for just a minute and focus on the task at hand. Either way, artwork is a wonderful way to connect to ourselves, but also the world around us. Art has a way to connect people, a way to inspire hope in others. And over the past weeks, I've really tried to choose artists that can be inspiring to us, that allow us to take a moment to reflect and stay in the present moment with this. But with everything that's happening in our country right now, I think it's also important to show how artwork can lead to social change, and how artwork can change people's minds, give them a different perspective if you're the viewer, or artwork can allow us as the artist to express our identity. So today we're going to kind of talk about a couple artists who do that. But before we kind of jump into who they are or their artwork, let's just take a moment to maybe clear our minds and get centered before we start talking about art today. So I'm going to start with a little bit of a meditation, as we normally do. So wherever you're sitting right now, kind of find a comfortable space in your chair, and make sure you're sitting tall, or you're resting your back against the back of your chair. However you want to rest, make sure your feet are firmly on the ground, because we really want to feel grounded in this moment. As I mentioned, if you have all those emotions and feelings inside, allowing us to come back to the present moment and to our breath gives us the opportunity to focus in and to really feel like we are ready to kind of take in new information and ready to learn a little bit about these artists. So let's get right into it. So your feet are against the ground, you're sitting tall, and I imagine there's a string pulling your body upward. So you're really let your shoulders drop, sit up. You can close your eyes if you'd like, kind of point them downward softly. And let's just take a few deep breaths together. And I encourage you, as you breathe in, imagine you're breathing in the feeling of being focused and energized with each new breath. And then with the breath you let out, imagine letting out any stale air in your body, any uncomfortable feelings, or anything that's keeping you from being focused. So you're taking in the good and you're letting out the bad. And let's just kind of do a few breaths together as we kind of focus on that idea. So let's breathe in. Breathe out. And I encourage you to breathe out with sound. Breathe out with a sigh. So when you're taking your breath in, rise your shoulders up. And so you really feel the release when you breathe out. And you drop those shoulders. Couple more. Two more together. One. last one. All right. So hello again, welcome. I hope you all feel a little more focused, grounded, and energized as we're ready to talk about these artists today. So as I mentioned, we have talked about a lot of artists who've maybe changed the art world. And last week, or if you saw my talk on street art, we started to see how artwork in the public sphere can address social issues. But today I really wanted to focus on African American artists in our history, women in particular, who in using their identity because of who they were and through their artwork were able to influence social change or get people to kind of change some perspectives. So, and also focusing our attention and recognition on artists from the African American community can kind of bring our focus to that, and a lot of them and a lot of you as viewers may not know of their work, and the art world as a whole has not given them much recognition in a lot of ways. So I think it's important to highlight them, especially during this time. So one thing that we will kind of cycle back throughout this entire talk as we talk about these two artists today is the idea of the narratives going on in America and how using your art in an authentic way can really change others' viewpoints through their interaction with artwork. And that, again, and as I've said before, is the power of imagery and the power of storytelling. So that's going to be a theme that runs through our artwork today that we'll be talking about. So let's look at our first artist. You may have been looking at her and seeing her work here, or seeing her photograph more rather, here. This is Alma Thomas. Now I'm not sure if you can see her name at the bottom there, but here she is in her studio in her later years, behind her paintings, and she's looking at us thoughtfully with a paintbrush in her hand. And she is one of those artists, I think, that has been overlooked by the art world for a variety of reasons, but whose artwork began well before and throughout the civil rights movement in America in the 60s. And she is, as I mentioned before, Alma Thomas. So let's get a little bit about her background. She was born in Columbus, Georgia in 1891, and she lived with her very large family. And she was creative from a very young age, making small puppets, sculptures, and plates out of clay that she found around her in her environment. But due to segregation and discrimination in the North, especially in the early 1900s, the segregation and discrimination in the South, in the early 1900s, Alma and her family were unable to go to museums and view artwork because of that segregation. So a lot of the artwork that Alma Thomas was exposed to when she was young was through her own inherent creativity and maybe from the people around her in her community. And that had a big impact on her early life for that reason. But her life kind of changed when, in 1907, her family made the decision to move to Washington, D.C. And this was for a variety of reasons. One was to escape the racial violence that was happening in the South. Her family, if they were to move more up north, would kind of be in a more accepting community, as well as give Alma Thomas and her siblings more of an opportunity to go to schools that would give them more proper schooling than they would have received if they had continued to live in Georgia. So while she did attend a better public school, it's also important to recognize that when she came to Washington, D.C. as 16 years old in high school, she was still in a segregated school. So while it was better than what she was receiving in Georgia, she was still not attending school with white children, just in a completely African American school. However, she showed interest in architecture and drawing, and when she moved to DC, that was when she was first introduced to art classes while she was in high school, and she took to it immediately. She loved learning about that art world that she had been unable to learn about when she was young. And after school, she studied to teach kindergarten, And in 1916, at the age of 25, she obtained her first teaching job in Delaware, teaching kindergarten. And she did that for 7 years. But what is so unique about Alma Thomas is that her education did not stop there. She actually became one of the first graduates of Howard University Fine Arts program. She got her BFA in 1924 at the age of 33. She was also the first African American woman to ever obtain an art degree in America. So she was a pioneer in her field for that reason. And so she was already making history, but she continued to do so. She even obtained more education later in life. But her true passion was teaching. And after her BFA degree in 1924, she then went on to become a junior high school teacher until her retirement in 1960. So for a majority of her life, she stayed in the same school and she worked as an art teacher. But even while she was teaching, she earned her master's in education at Columbia University and her art history degree from American University. She obtained that degree in art history at the age of 59. So some common themes that we see throughout her life was commitment to artwork, but also commitment to education and continuing to better herself through going to school. So she really kind of switched her artist self after obtaining her art history degree, because she really studied under very successful painters in the final decade of her teaching, which was from the year 1950 to 1960 before she retired. So I think it's important to keep in mind the historical and social construct at the time that Alma Thomas was becoming a successful and well-educated woman. Around this time, it was very odd even for a woman to want to keep obtaining these degrees, but especially a woman of color. And so she pursued this education in spite of discrimination she received on behalf of her race and gender. So she's obtaining all of these degrees, she's still teaching, but she is also still creating her own artwork. She never lost that artist self. She painted throughout her entire teaching career, but her early works were mostly representational and realistic. She painted people and still lives out of oil. So she showed some interest. The art world showed some interest in this, and she was in a few shows, but it never really caught on. Her name never really became recognized up until her retirement in the 60s. Because it was in her retirement that her work took a very dramatic shift. And this is also for a multitude of reasons. One really significant reason was that she was starting to develop arthritis in her hands. This made it very difficult for her to hold a paintbrush and paint very detailed work, which is what she had been doing all the way up until this point. And so she was kind of left with a choice. On one hand, this made her want to kind of give up painting because she was not able to paint in a way that she felt she could with the realistic works. But on the other hand, she was presented with an opportunity to change directions, to try something new and a new style. And she actually instead chose to do that. And she changed the medium she was working in. She then started working in watercolor and acrylic. And watercolor in particular gave her a freedom, especially at the beginning, to move in an unrealistic way. She let it flow out of her, and she kind of broke those bonds of realistic painting that she had been in throughout most of her career. So this allowed her to focus on abstract images, expressionism, color, movement, pattern, and so she became more of an abstract artist. So for that reason, it's said that her 70s and her 80s were actually her most important decades in terms of her work. It was only when she moved into this abstract period of her life after retirement that she began to receive the well-known in the art world kind of attention that she was seeking. So she began to experiment using color abstraction and repeated lines and colors. And that is kind of some of the artwork that I will show you today. Whoops, wrong one. Here we are. So here is kind of an example of that abstract style that she was working in. So how she kind of went about doing this is she would always sketch her work beforehand. So if you look at this work, what's kind of your initial thought about it? Do you feel like me in the sense it looks spontaneous? It almost doesn't look particularly planned. It looks as if she just was attracted to color and shape and just went for it without really sketching it first. At least that's how I see it, but that's actually not true with her process. She actually would map out every single shape with pencil on raw canvas first. Then she would, very particular in choosing her colors, would map out which line and which color would go next to one another. So it's actually a very planned and meticulous process on Alma Thomas's part. And in these paintings in real life, of course you can't see it in this image, but in real life, the raw canvas peeks through and you can also see her pencil marks on her work. So this painting here is titled Iris, Tulips, Jonquils, and Crocuses. It was painted in 1969, so 9 years after her retirement. So before I jump into talking about kind of the background of it or about this work, what is your initial impression of it? Do you like it? Does something draw you to it? Do you think she was trying to say anything with it? One question that I did ask myself a lot when looking at her artwork is I asked myself, does my view of this artwork change knowing that Alma Thomas is the artist and knowing her background story or her age even? Does that change the way you view the artwork? And this is just something I think it's important to keep in mind while viewing artwork, is it does change, I think, our perception of work if we know who the artist is. It changes the lens of which we view the artwork, if you will. So these are always questions I think we should keep in our mind as we look at work. When we look at this, what draws me in is the colors, and that is something that Alma Thomas was really focused on, was color theory. She was really interested in how colors looked next to one another. So this painting was actually inspired by Thomas's connection with nature. So a lot of her work after retirement, it didn't really focus so much on the social context issues of the time. So if we think about the time of in America that she painted this painting, it was in 1969. She did not want to focus on the civil rights movement or her identity as a Black woman. She instead wanted to focus on things that brought her joy or other aspects of her identity as more of an artist. So she wanted to focus on nature. And she often studied the hues, patterns, and movements of the flowers and trees in her own garden, as well as the parks around her in Washington, D.C. So I wonder, knowing that the title of this work is Irises, Crocus, Jonquils, do you see them kind of in here now that you know she might have been thinking of a garden or about flowers while painting this artwork? Do you kind of see maybe that in here? Or does it make you think of something else entirely? It's interesting. So let's look at another piece of her artwork, another example of her artwork. So here's another one. This one is titled Starry Night and the Astronauts, painted in 1972. Now, just knowing the title and perhaps knowing the American history around this time, I wonder what this painting reminds you of or makes you think about. Or maybe if you can guess what she was inspired by, if we think about Starry Night and Astronauts in the 70s. You may have guessed it, but Alma Thomas was inspired by the moon landing in 1969. And this launched an entire new series of her work. She moved from painting garden scenes to more painting images inspired by space, the sky, venturing out into space. And knowing that, maybe we can look at this image in a different way. If we think about it being a starry night and astronauts, we look at, this is still her classic style. If you look closely, it's still these individual brush strokes layered on top of one another in almost a linear pattern. But the way she used the dark blue hues does make you feel like an empty expanse of sky. You feel like, if like you're like me anyway, that is drawing you in. And she wanted it to have, and she said, a sort of floating energy about it. The energy of going out into a large expanse like space and existing in that space. I wonder if that comes through to you. She did not mention what this upper color in the corner was, which contrasts greatly to the blue in the sky. And I wonder what you might think that this is up in the corner here. Is that maybe a reference to the sun or a star? Who knows? So around the same time she painted this space series, she actually became, at the age of 81, the first African-American woman to have a solo exhibit at the Whitney Museum of American Art. So while she strived throughout her entire art career to not be solely identified as being a Black woman artist, she was still recognized that way because of her identity. Because she was a Black woman making this artwork, the American public did not separate her from that identity. They always identified her as a Black American woman during her shows. And I think that's just a very interesting phenomenon, showing kind of how we view, those racial tensions in the art world and in our society in general. So this is a very different ideology that Alma Thomas had of just wanting to be identified as an artist first over her race or her gender than other African American artists at the time who really did focus on racial injustice and that more of their identity. So she said this about wanting to be identified first as an artist. She said, "The use of color in my paintings is of paramount importance to me. Through color, I have sought to concentrate on beauty and happiness in my paintings, rather than on man's inhumanity to man." So maybe in a way, perhaps she was not focusing intentionally on not showing her identity because she wanted to forget about that part of herself. Instead, maybe she was focusing on color and line and mood in her paintings instead to give more beauty and happiness into the world instead of focusing more on the negative things around her. So that's just one perspective of an artist during this time. And I wanted to show that perspective as well as the next African American woman artist we will look at who saw to use her artwork in a completely different way. So we have these two kind of perspectives going. So let's look at our next artist and how she used her artwork to kind of communicate. Now, some of you may know our next artist, but this is Faith Ringgold, who is still alive and working today. I forgot to mention, whereas Alma Thomas actually passed away in 1978. Faith Ringgold is younger and began her work not before the Civil Rights Movement, but right around that time, and she's still making work today. So let's learn a little bit more about Faith Ringgold's background. So Faith Ringgold was the youngest of 3 children, and she was born in 1930 in Harlem, New York. And her family was middle class, and they were displaced by the Great Migration, leading to them moving to the city and at this time in history. Now, again, just like Alma Thomas, I think it's very important to talk about kind of the social movement of the time and in the 30s. So during this time, as many of you know, this was around the Great Depression, but also around the time of the Harlem Renaissance. So she's holding both of these things in her hands. On the Great Depression, on one hand, is economic devastation for the country, a lot of skimping of resources, maybe a lot of fear. in a lot of ways, but she's also, on the other hand, growing up in Harlem, New York during the Harlem Renaissance, which is full of vibrancy and revolution in music and jazz and artwork. So she has a vibrant community and one that's struggling in the general America at the same time. And this is the moment that she's growing up in her childhood, is in this environment. And she had also, just like Alma Thomas, a very close relationship to her family. And they, like Alma Thomas, they encouraged her creativity. Her mother was a fashion designer and her father was an avid storyteller. And we will see how both of those perspectives influenced her artwork moving forward. But she grew up in a very creative environment and a very, very creative household. So she was right in the heart of that. And so at a very young age, she was drawing with crayons, she was sewing with her mother. It was surrounding her at all times. And she said this of her early childhood. She said, "I grew up in Harlem during the Great Depression. This did not mean I was poor and oppressed. We were protected from oppression and surrounded by a loving family." So while these positive influences existed in her childhood and young adulthood, we cannot also forget the effects of racism, sexism, and segregation that she was also feeling in New York and the country at this time as well. And so both of these are going to influence her artwork as she moves forward. So let's look at the first artwork we have from her. So her story continues in 1950 as she was encouraged by her family to pursue an art major at the City College of New York. So similar also to Alma Thomas, she actually had a really tough time breaking into the art world, because this is where the sexism kind of comes in, because women were also discouraged from pursuing art degrees at this time and were kind of segued instead into art education. So if you were a woman who had a lot of interest in becoming an artist, that was very white male dominated at the time. So she had to kind of find a way around that by entering into art education instead. And so she got her degree in art education, and she continued to teach, just like Alma Thomas, in New York public schools as an art teacher. So this is about the time when her painting career really began, because she was learning about African American writers like James Baldwin, as well as studying African art, but she was also getting Impressionism and Cubism, and she was learning all about these art movements. So this kind of began her art career and influencing her early art, as we can see here. She set out to make a series of flat figures and shapes representing people of America. So this is an example of one of those paintings in her early art career, where that was titled the American People series. And this painting itself was titled The American Dream. And this was her 9th painting in this American People series. So again, let's talk about the social context of the time. She began this series in the 60s. And as I mentioned, this was in the civil rights movement. So instead of Alma Thomas, who was instead focusing on more of color and abstraction and pattern to provide beauty and a different way of seeing happiness during this time as a Black woman, Faith Ringgold was really saying, no, I need to make paintings that directly point out the underlying racism in everyday activities that African American individuals face. And she specifically wanted to do that from a women's point of view. So knowing the title, American Dream, of this painting, I wonder what you think Faith Ringgold was trying to portray. What was her underlying message from this painting? If we view it, let's kind of look at it in the sense of the content of this image. So if we see it, we see a woman in this kind of abstracted cubist style. But it looks as if there's a line going directly halfway through this woman, and on one half of herself, she could look like she painted a white woman. And on the other half of the painting, it looks as if she painted an African American woman. So in thinking of the title American Dream, I wonder what you think she was trying to say in showing this half and half, dividing this woman. Was she maybe talking about how the American dream might be an open avenue to some women in this country versus other women, depending on the color of your skin? Was she talking about African American women wanting to obtain the American dream, or was she criticizing it? All of this dialogue was starting to happen around these paintings she was doing of American individuals in the civil rights movement. She was starting to ask these questions to the general American public. And people were believing this series was asking more the question, why? Why do we have these ideologies? Why do we have these politics of America? It was bringing those into question. And in response to this series, Ringgold actually stated this: I could not act like everything was okay. I could not paint landscapes in the 1960s. There was too much going on. So she was saying, I can't ignore my identity. I can't ignore what is happening to my people. I have to paint in response to this. I have to ask the viewer why. Make them look at these things. And then again, that's in drastic contrast to Alma Thomas at the time. So Ringgold, in wanting to show herself not just as an artist, but really as a Black woman artist, putting all of those identities together and saying they cannot be separated. They can't be separated like Alma Thomas was saying. They're all interwoven. And she stated her viewpoint in this quote. She said, "It's the 1960s. All hell is breaking loose all over, and you're painting flowers and leaves. You cannot do that. Your job is to tell your story." And that's what Faith Ringgold really set out to do, was tell stories through her artwork. However, the larger American public, they didn't want to view Faith Ringgold's story. Galleries and museums were hesitant to show her work. She was not getting many sales from her paintings, particularly her paintings that were more racially charged. Perhaps they were too real to confront, or perhaps the audience at the time believed them to be too extreme. So she was running into a tension. She wanted to make sure her work was heard, but she also needed to find a way it could be received without changing the core of her message, but also without compromising her powerful identity. And that's quite the challenge she was faced with. And how was she going to compromise? Was she supposed to compromise to fit the mold of what the art world wanted to see from her? So these were the things she was wrestling with at this time. So in the early 80s, Faith Ringgold highlighted this tension in this quote. She said, "During that time, I was trying to get my autobiography published, but no one wanted to print my story. In 1983, I began writing stories on my quilts as an alternative. That way, when my quilts were hung up to look at or photographed for a book, people could still read my story. They were written in a way that I write my children's stories. Each section written on the quilt is like a page." So what Faith Ringgold did to absolve this tension was she used her textile history, her textile art, to first create quilts out of pieces of fabric. Then she used paint to directly paint on top of the quilts and also write in small squares directly on the quilt stories. They were stories of her life or stories about African American people, stories that were supposed to have the viewer directly think about and ask those questions of why. And if they wanted to see her artwork, they then had to read her story, or they had to look at it and make the active choice not to. And this is different than trying to get her words published, because everything was then becoming one. Her story could not be misinterpreted. She had written it word for word on these quilts. And that's also significant because if you think about giving an interview, whoever was interviewing Faith Ringgold could interpret her words differently if they chose to, or they could choose not to publish her book. But they could not ignore the words she wrote on her quilts. So this is the direction of artwork that Faith Ringgold went down for the rest of the decades up until the present day, is these what she deemed story quilts. So the one we see here, is titled Who's Afraid of Aunt Jemima? And before we kind of jump into the actual story, let's kind of talk about what we see here. And it's very hard to see, I imagine, looking on this video, but in each of these yellow squares, we see a portrait. And these portraits are of white men and women, as well as men and women of color, interspersed with just pieces of fabric, but also these white squares. And on each of these white squares are tiny, tiny writings. And these were the story that she was writing directly on there. And in the middle here it says, Who's Afraid of Aunt Jemima? Quilt and Book by Faith Ringgold. So this was actually Faith Ringgold's first story quilts. The first one where she broke out of creating just narrative images and she actually put words to it. So she wrote this story to directly confront the most malignant black female stereotype, or the mammy, a black woman being referred to as a mammy figure throughout American history and televised on television and books. And this is the stereotype of the black woman maid and caretaker in a white household. And she was asking the viewer to directly confront that, saying, who's afraid of this person? Now, who is a good, she was kind of asking us the question, who is a good African-American person, good black person, and who is one to be afraid of? And why is the white American public afraid of one and not the other? So she was asking this question of the viewer directly by depicting a story about one of these characters. She was narrating one of these characters in a narrative, asking us to ask those questions. And it reads like a book, taking the reader square by square as they learn the life tale of all of these characters in the quilt and how are they connected. She has stated that a story allows Faith Ringgold to directly tell the viewer her intent and say her message in a clear way. She can shape her own narrative of African American culture, not through the lens of a white person. And I think that there's so much inherent power in that. And it was so revolutionary at the time to subvert getting your work published and putting it directly on the artwork. Such a beautiful idea. So let's talk about her next story quilt. Now this is a small image and I realize it's kind of hard to see. But the next image we've got here is titled Tar Beach, number 2. It was done in 1990. So now we're into the 90s here. So let's kind of look closely at this image and I'll point out to you kind of what we're seeing here. So down at the bottom here, we see what looks like an African American family eating, having a picnic or a dinner party on a roof in New York City. This is supposed to be depicting in New York. And off to the side, we see a couple of African American children, a girl and a boy, kind of laying on a mattress on the roof. And this is supposed to be Tar Beach. So Tar Beach was the tar-covered blacktop on a building in New York. And this story and the words are written very tiny in the sky on this story quilt. Tells the story of these two children taking a flight over top the buildings of New York City. And you can see the children actually flying in the sky at the top of the quilt there, looking over this entire city. So these paintings were reminiscent of Faith Ringgold's childhood growing up in Harlem and her family atmosphere. She tells a story of a young girl and boy who fly over the city to learn about their family and about their own potentials. So one of the panels in the sky says, "Only 8 years old and in the 3rd grade, I can fly. That means I am free to go wherever I want to for the rest of my life." So reading those words, what do you think she was trying to symbolize or say to the viewer of this quilt? And who even is the viewer? Perhaps she's talking about the freedom she wants to feel as a Black woman and her desire for self-possession and to feel at home and free in her own body. Maybe she's talking, maybe her audience is other African Americans, giving them permission for that freedom, that same freedom and self-possession. Or maybe she's talking to the white audience, saying that they deserve that freedom and self-possession. It can be looked at in a number of ways, and I think what's interesting is that depending on the viewer, you can read a different message and perceive that story differently on who your identity is as you confront the story inherent in Faith Ringgold's work. So what's wonderful about this Tar Beach series, and she actually made a variety of quilts, story quilts, around this same idea, around the idea of Tar Beach. And what's beautiful about that is this story quilt actually she took it a step further, and she put Tar Beach into an illustrated book in 1991. So she took each of these small paragraphs and she made them into a full page in an illustrated storybook she painted. And this book went on to win over 20 awards, including the Coretta Scott King Award for Best Illustrated Children's Book in the year 1991. So her message was able to reach more people as a response to her once again expanding her art practice and thinking of new ways to reach her audiences and new ways to get her message out. So it feels like we just begun, but that brings us to the end of our talk today. Now, I hope this brought some inspirations and maybe some questions into your mind about the power of artwork and whose voices that we showcase within art history, and how can an artist use their voice for social change. And additionally, how art itself can give people identity and power and possession over their own life stories, however they want that to be perceived. Like Alma Thomas, how she wanted her artwork to be perceived and her life story to be perceived is very different than that of Faith Ringgold, but both of them have that value, and art gives us that power. So next week, we're going to continue to explore African American artists and how they are using their identities and their stories and their artwork to influence social change. And we're going to look at some more recent and younger artists next week. But today, I just want us to end with this Faith Ringgold quote. She states, "You can't sit around and wait for somebody to say who you are. You need to write it and paint it and do it." So I encourage you to make art this week that says who you are. Explore your own identity. I'll be excited to see it. Please email it to us. But until next time, I hope that you all stay well, and I'll talk to you soon.